Welcome back. Well, South Africa has taken the G20 presidency, becoming the first African country to assume this role. The milestone follows the African Union's attendance at this year's summit in Brazil as a permanent member, a status granted in 2023. And joining me now as we reflect on this year's summit and look ahead to some of the issues South Africa will be advocating for as it takes the reins is Executive Director at the African Future Policies Hub, Faten Aggad. Thank you so much for your time, Faten. Now, just talk to us about what it means for Africa to have a permanent seat at the table of the G20.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, this decision of last year to incorporate the African Union was critical for many reasons. I think, as we know, the G20 is the primary economic, global economic policy framework and platform. They've been taking a lot of decisions and coordinating on major economic issues, from trade to international finance, and how, for example, the international financial architecture is functioning. How does cooperation among the G20 members work? And many of those decisions actually impact African countries. To give you a very specific example, within the G20 framework, although it's not as such a decision-making body, which is something I think we need to emphasize on, but it's an important coordination space. But within the G20, a lot of coordination takes place between the members on how, for example, they will tackle issues such as debt. And we had, within the context of the G20, certainly post-COVID crisis, several African countries found themselves in a situation of a debt crisis. And to move forward on that, in terms of finding a solution, it was the G20 that was the go-to framework to address this. But unfortunately, at the time, none of, besides South Africa, other African countries did not have space. And the hope is that through an African Union representation on the table, that we're able to bring some of the concerns of those countries and participate in decision-making around them.
I mean, you talk about that debt, and we know Africa is dealing with a huge debt crisis. And over there, is it a matter of, when we move forward and when Africa talks, they're talking about better frameworks, more favorable terms in terms of financing? What exactly are the priorities there?
The priorities are yet to be articulated as such, but we know that there is a red thread in terms of a common African ask, so to speak, within the G20. The issues around finances and finding a solution on debt is one central piece of the work. We've also seen the African Union, as well as South Africa, pushing for discussions around the international trading system that has also not particularly favored the continent. And we're seeing increasingly, again, coming out of Africa, is this notion of global inequalities, and how do we handle global inequalities, poverty-related issues. As I said, around the G20, even though it's a strictly coordination framework, but we have the powerful countries on the table. And so we need to use that as a way to not only make the G20 about their priorities, but make the G20 a space that can respond to the needs of the majority of the population of this globe. And so for Africa, bringing in that dimension of what do these decisions mean in terms of development, in particular, has been quite central.
Yeah, and of course, because obviously to also build sustainable economies in Africa, there's also the issue of climate change and climate finance. Now, considering, Africa's role in that global financial system, how much of a priority is climate finance there? And really also just reaching terms that don't put Africa under pressure as we try to build more greener economies.
That's the climate finance issue, and how do we deal with responses to climate generally in a just and fair manner, has increasingly become important within the G20 agenda. There's obviously, I think we need to keep in mind that it's an agenda that has been heavily influenced by geopolitics. We're coming out of COP29.
Yes.
Where discussions around climate finance have been subject to geopolitical ping-pong games. But the G20 is here becomes extremely important to at least help elevate the conversation. So for the African continent, generally, because of our low historical responsibility in terms of emission, we've been saying that most of the developed countries have now used their carbon budget, and they're essentially exceeding that use. And for them, because they're exceeding, we're getting affected, they simply need to cough up the cash. And that cash has been not particularly forthcoming. We had hoped that the G20 meeting in Rio that was concluded recently would help unlock the conversation on that, but it wasn't quite able to. But for the African continent, and the hope is that with South Africa coming on board from the 1st of December, that we're able then to push that agenda in a way that does not put the burden on our countries in terms of response, but in a way where we promote international cooperation, or otherwise, frankly, we would be in a situation of dysfunctioning of multilateralism, where countries will need to find their own way, including in terms of financing to respond to the impact. But that's not necessarily useful for common kind of global action, which we need around climate.
Yeah, all right. Well, we will be keeping our ears to the ground in terms of analysis on the conversations that did come out of the G20 meeting, of course, as we pave the way for South Africa hosting that next year. Thank you so much for your time, Faten. That was Faten Aggad from the African Future Policies Hub.